Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're back with another Iron Age comic review, and we're taking a look at Narwhal's Grand Prix, part 1 of 6. What is all this about? Well, let's start as we usually do with the physical review. And if you're not familiar, I'm going to do a complete review of the product, and then I will give a spoiler warning, and then I will do some critique. But this is part 1 of 6. So just like Earthbound, the previous comic in this series, this is going to be divided into installments, but it's going to be a lot of installments, at least compared to Earthbound, which was 2. And I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. But since this is a serialized installment, 6 parts, I'm going to talk about this slightly different way than I have previous works I've discussed. I am going to do a full critique, but also when I finish my review, I'm going to indulge in speculation. I think that's part of what makes a serialized story interesting. You have the water cooler talk from TV, right? That's where after you watch the episode, you go to the water cooler and you talk about what you saw and what you think is going to happen. That is the appeal. Like, that is the thing that sets serialized storytelling apart from, a complete story, right? If you just sit down and you watch a movie, there is no time to go to the water cooler and talk about it in the middle, unless you have one of those really old movies. Mission. So that kind of speculation, a great way to market your story, to keep it in people's minds, and also it is a great way to what Narwhal calls interactivity, to bring people into the story and have them think about it as they experience it. Also makes it easier to produce the story because you don't have to make such huge chunks at once. You can iterate on your story even as you are telling it, which has its high points and its low points, admittedly. All in all, I'm very interested in examining this on all levels, so I'm going to indulge in a little speculation myself. And as the story goes on, we get future installments. I intend to look back on my speculations, not just as speculation on the story, but perhaps as part of the storytelling process. Because you know that Narwhal is very deliberate about building interactivity as he tells the story. Let's talk a little bit about the art here. This cover is by Matt Cosson, very nice, and it has a nice ability. Like, I have seen a fair amount of Cosson art, and he does something interesting here. He, instead of drawing it in his own style, he took a much lighter hand to this, I think, and tried to imitate Narwhal's style. It's pretty neat. Pretty neat. Interiors are by Narwhal himself, and this is Narwhal's art. It continues to improve. His composition has always been strong. I think his ability to render, to maintain proportions while still having that sense of gesture flow that characterizes his art is continuously improving. I like this a lot. I understand, as always, that kind of loose, sketchy style without a whole lot of rendering is not going to appeal to everyone. It has a lot of interest to me because I'm fascinated by the composition and how he gets that sense of gesture into what he draws. It's going to be to taste. Another thing that's going to be to taste is his of computer-generated imagery, especially as backgrounds. This is a sci-fi story, and it's set in space. So he generates something like, I believe this wormhole here is computer-generated. And it looks a little inorganic. It looks a little alien and weird with Narwhal's loose, sketchy art style superimposed on top of it. I think that's deliberate. I think that idea there is to create a sense of space as other than the environment we're used to, and it achieves that. Again, I think mileage is going to vary depending on who looks at this. Fortunately, there are preview pages available. Look at those and ask yourself, is this illustration style, is this blending of CG images, is that going to help me get into the story, or is it going to take me out of the story? That's a question the reader has to answer for themselves. I find it, the CG I find a little bit jarring at times, but for the most part, I can roll with it. And of course, I've already said I am a fan of Narwhal's sense of composition and flow in how he illustrates. All of that is very interesting to me. Not for you. I recognize that it's not for you. but I can't make a recommendation about it one way or another. It's very hit or miss, my experience. What people like this and what people don't like this. So I can't give you any idea whether it's going to vibe with you or not. It's very hard to compare it to anything else because there's very little, especially in Western comics, that approaches this attempt at visual storytelling. Again, go and look at it, come to your own decision. That's all I can really say. Coloring wise, I noticed that the coloring palette here is a little desaturated compared to Earthbound, which was the previous comic in the series. Earthbound had very bright colors, and I found it made it very easy to tell what was going on. Narwhal has this loose, sketchy style with a lot of thin lines. There's not a lot of variation in line weight, and there's not a lot of heavy blacks in it. I found that those bright colors helped me read what was going on very quickly. And since the highly contrasting colors flowed very naturally with the shapes they occupied, it's very easy to tell what was going on at a glance, what was important to focus in on and understand in more detail, and what wasn't. A lot of that is lost in coloring, unfortunately. There are some places where it works fairly well, like we have this neon lit scene with I think that's a robot and a human, and that it kind of does a good job showing emphasis on characters, what's going on. Here's another scene just on the next page where I think the lighting does that a lot, but there are a lot of pages where I feel like it's just hard to read what's going on, especially in the space scene, where you have these dark stealth ships that are also against black background of space. I understand that's realistic, but it doesn't help reading comprehension. And I think that could have used a little more work to help the reader understand what was going on without having to slow down, really stare at the page, and ask yourself, important, this important, important. I understand that you do have to slow down the reader's eye in places, but this felt like it was much. Again, some more points of brightness and interest, some more variation in line weights help break that up. But line weight thing, that's not Narwhal's illustration style. And so the colors which we're making up for that are in most part lost. And that's unfortunately, I think, a loss of some comprehensibility for the illustration. Writing wise, this is a very, very great setup chapter because it builds mystery and intrigue in several different directions and also clearly tells us what the important mechanics in here are going to be. The Grand Prix is some kind of battle tournament. We don't know a whole lot about the Grand Prix itself, but around the Grand Prix, there is a meta rule. You have these things called butterfly rings. And the person wearing a male butterfly ring, if he's killed, will be transmitted to a female butterfly ring, and his body will be rebuilt there with all his memories intact. So functionally, as long as you're wearing a male butterfly ring, you're immortal. As long as you get that ring back on, your body will rebuild itself wherever the receiver female butterfly ring is, and you'll be okay. The catch is, there are these things called dream catchers that can hijack your soul as it moves from where your male butterfly ring is, where your female butterfly ring. These are the basic mechanics of the story, and we see them used in a couple of different ways here right away. I don't want to spoil those here in the review section, so I'll just say I think a lot of thought was put into them, and they are clearly explained to us without being hit over the head on it. This is a big improvement on Narwhal's part. I think I had to read Earthbound 3 times before I fully understood all of the mechanics, the characters, dynamics in between them, and situation everyone was in. There were so many moving parts, and Narwhal clearly understood them, but he didn't have the technique to express them to the audience in a quickly understandable way. It took several tries for me to get all of them, and a less invested reader may not take the time to work out all of those bits and pieces. So this story, I think, is a lot friendlier for new readers who don't have the investment or the trust necessary yet to understand that Narwhal is going to do something interesting with all of these parts and give us a satisfying story out of it. And even if there is a satisfying story in there, if you don't get all of the parts, well, you may not actually get the satisfaction. This is a clear sign that Narwhal's storytelling has leveled up. He is telling people what they need to know in a much more comprehensible way than he has been in the past, at least in this series. I talked about Foreign Agent and other stories elsewhere where I think he was definitely building towards this. And we see that coming to fruition in one of these really complicated multi-faction, multi-gambit stories. Uh, and Grand Prix is promising us same kind of crazy, you know, off the wall climax to the series that Earthbound had, but in a way that is much easier to understand, and that is a huge plus. I think Grand Prix is going to be a much more normie friendly story than Earthbound was. I liked Earthbound, but it took a lot of work to figure out everything that was going on. I could tell that was going to be worth it because I have a pretty good nose for story. At least I flatter myself that I do. And I was invested in seeing how all those pieces work. But it's hard to say to somebody you need to really sit down and read the story multiple times in order to understand it. And having a story where, like, I got the basics of Grand Prix the first time through. I read it a second time just to make sure I had everything straight. But it's the first time through as opposed to the third time through. That is a real improvement. The story, as I said, for the most part, is set up. It sets up the basic mechanic, sets up several of the key players, and gives us the return of Julia, WizKid, and Blogart from Earthbound, characters that people who read that series will already be familiar with, but they are contextualized in this completely different manner as part of the Grand Prix that will make it very easy for people who are not yet familiar with these characters to figure out basically who they are and what they're about. We can tell that, for example, WizKid and Blogart have a history. WizKid never wanted to fight in the Grand Prix. We can tell all those things just from these 48 pages. And that's a very good character setup there as well. Other interesting thing about this is Narwhal takes some time to clean up his setting. What do I mean by that? Earthbound, there were weapons called R-types, which you could shoot somebody with, and instead of killing them, you would mind control them. That's a very scary weapon, and it obviously has a lot of combat applications. However, there's now a solution to R-type technology. That's one of the first things we're told in here. So in order to make sure that he doesn't have to constantly take into account the existence of a mind control device, Narwhal just says somebody's developed a countermeasure, and I believe, in the short story compilation, we found out some of how that countermeasure was developed. Although obviously for something like the R-type, you don't need to get too deep into it. You can just say it's sci-fi stuff, and then more sci-fi stuff was created to solve this problem. So that is another good thing. When you have these sci-fi settings where things just get more and more complicated, it can be very difficult to tell a story in them because there's all these moving parts. That cleanup, very good, and very, very, I don't want to say necessary, very wise. So, speculation. What do we see here? Well, we see Julia, WizKid, and Blogart all entering Grand Prix. They enter the Grand Prix with new sponsors. I believe Julia is with the 10th sponsor, and WizKid is with the 11th. And that is interesting. Okay, let me just double check. Make sure. Because one of the things I noticed in here that we meet a whole new set of sponsors. In Earthbound, the 12th and 13th sponsors were the primary people who play. We have a whole new set of sponsors in this story. And again, this is part of what I mean when I say Narwhal has brought back some characters, but he's put them in new context that lets us them in a different light. Yes, he is with a 10th sponsor. So by doing this, we grow the world, but we don't make it any harder to track what's going on because at least right now, 12th and 13th sponsors are not players. And new readers don't have to worry about figuring out who the 12th and 13th sponsors are, on top of figuring out who Julia, WizKid, and Blogart are. Set up a lot of interesting mystery hooks as well. Um, I mentioned before, dream catchers can catch souls as they move from one butterfly ring to another. That's one of the first things we see happen here, but we're never told who that person is. It's a great mystery hook going into the second installment. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to guess the person in that mystery dreamcatcher is Spaceman, because he's the only character from Earthbound we haven't seen in this volume. It would be very appropriate if he was there. We just didn't know it yet. So that's exciting to find out as well. Really great hook. The other hook that we have in here that I won't say how exactly, but they're potential of fake butterfly rings um, that cannot save your life when you're killed are also introduced here. So not only do we know at least one person has one of them, anyone in upcoming parts of the story could have these. What kind of gambits can you do with that? Like, could you swap out someone else's butterfly ring for a fake, and then you have a real ring to keep you alive, and somebody on an opposing team is going to get knocked off when they think they're covered. These are all great ideas that play on that one basic mechanic, the butterfly ring, but make it more complicated and make all kinds of gambits that people can use in the future. How are they going to use it? What does the fact that they have to enter this temple zone where people are at the mercy of the temple creator who can kick them out randomly for whatever reason he wants? I mean, technically, there are rules. But when the temple or any other place is in the hands of a capricious creator, they can probably kick people out for whatever reason they want. I suppose that will be established more in the future. But these basic mechanics to the world are set up very clearly, and they're clearly going to be a part of what we see going on. We also see the champion princess of the 10th sponsor. Yeah, she's a very interesting character, and she brings a new perspective on the Grand Prix. She seems to suffer a degree of ennui that we didn't really see in WizKid or Julia or even Spaceman in Earthbound, all of whom were people that were kind of expecting to wind up in the Grand Prix. So we're seeing a lot of different points of view on the Grand Prix as well. Great stuff. So I think that we're going to see a lot of talk about what the Grand Prix is for and what it does to people, as well as a lot of very clever gambits using these basic fake rings and dreamcatcher gambits, possibly even getting people kicked out of the temple using unauthorized weapons. That's all fascinating stuff that I look forward to seeing developed more installments. Great stuff, great hooks, pretty good character setup, and most importantly, a clear sense of different priorities, different people, and different things that they want to accomplish. Let's talk spoilers. There are a couple of things in here that I do want to talk about that I couldn't get to in the critique. So one of the things is that the Siren System Violence, I believe, is the name. They were in Earthbound as well, and they are turned into the 8th sponsor. Then the 8th sponsor puts butterfly rings on them and kills them. That's an interesting trick using butterfly rings, because they can then perform an autopsy of the bodies of the sisters they have, while the sisters themselves will survive and continue to be viable competitors perhaps later down the road. In the meantime, we know that they have advanced combat abilities, make them pretty much superhuman. And it looks like these combat abilities, or whatever part of their physiology allows them to have those abilities, are distilled into injections given to this guy here. I forget what his name is off the top of my head. He's a new character, and he's the actual entry, the 8th sponsor. He has several vials of this distilled injection they made out of the bodies of the original sisters. That's very grim, and it says a lot about what some of these sponsors win. But it's also an interesting element to have in play. So not only do we get a power-up that a potentially hostile and certainly very sinister player can use at random, get a sense of the world and how very serious sponsors are about things, and kind of how malevolent they can be the way they pursue ends. I really appreciated that element because it does a lot more than just world build or show the nasty guys. It also sets up a very important element of the story. I thought that was pretty good storytelling, and it shows us as well the themes of Earthbound are going to continue to play in here because mind control was the technology. Earthbound, that's a pretty unethical technology. Well, injections, man, equally as unethical. But what do you do now that they exist? That's a great question to have to wrestle with. It's not a super philosophical story at a glance, but there are clearly some deep thoughts in here that Narwhal intends to examine, at least a little bit, as he goes through the story. Another interesting thing here is the appearance of Blogart, who is not what I would consider top tier combat potential. Yet he's sent in as WizKid's partner by the 11th sponsor. Not really a partner, I guess. We're told that the 11th sponsor can only afford to enter one person in the Grand Prix this time around. But it's interesting that Blogart is here. He's a bit of a wild card. He tends to pull unorthodox things out of nowhere when the pressure is on. But also the character we know has a bad butterfly ring. And Blogart was not the most cautious person in Earthbound. So I do kind of wonder what's going to come of all of those elements being centered around one character, WizKid's sidekick. Very interesting. And the quantum state of Spaceman, also a little bit worrying. Spaceman was incredibly dangerous in Earthbound, and the fact that he had the R-type and was just using it to take over people, one of the few things that prevented him from just, massacring people in fights. The fact that he was taking them over rather than killing them. If he shows up not as the person caught in this dream catcher, but as a fully viable competitor, man, that could be a lot of trouble for WizKid as well. Then there's the fact that WizKid and Julia are on separate sides in this story. There's, again, all kinds of elements here stacked up one on top of the other that are going to make life pretty tough for everyone involved. So, yeah, I like the potential for conflict in the story. I like the setup. I'm very curious how all these different mechanics and small, I guess, silver bullets, for lack of a better term, things like the fake butterfly ring or the serum that given out made from the Sirens of Violence. All of those things, I think I'll just call silver bullets in the story, and they have a lot of potential to come into play at key moments. I'm fascinated to see what comes of it. It's a very fun book. I do recommend it if you're into this kind of very I don't want to say video gamey, very puzzly storytelling where elements stack up in new and surprising ways, and they come back in ways you weren't expecting. And Narwhal is very good at that. I'm looking forward to seeing what he does in Grand Prix. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.